The man known to history as Hugo Boss was born on the 8th of July 1885 in the town of Metzingen in the Swabia region of Germany, which lies in Baden-Württemberg in the southwest of the country. His father was Heinrich Boss, who ran a lingerie and linen shop in the town. His mother was Louisa Boss. Hugo was the fifth and last child his parents had. However, growing up, he only had one sibling, as 3 of Heinrich and Louisa's children died in infancy, a larger than average rate of child mortality by the standards of the late 19th century. As Hugo was the only one of Heinrich and Louisa's sons to survive, he was chosen to be their heir over his older sister. Consequently, from a young age, he was brought into the family business in Metzingen and was learning the trade of running the family store and also textile weaving and manufacturing. This was interrupted in 1903 when he was called up to the German Imperial Army at a time when peacetime conscription was practiced in Germany and all young men were expected to serve 2 years in the military. His training was completed by 1905, at which time he briefly took up a position working in a weaving mill in the town of Konstanz, south of Metzingen. This appears to have simply been another element of Boss's preparation for taking over the family business by getting hands-on training on the production side, and as his parents entered retirement, he stepped in to take over the shop in Metzingen in 1908. It was a small, though relatively profitable business, and Hugo appears to have run it with a reasonable degree of success during these first years of his ownership. It was also right around the time that he took over the store in Metzingen that Hugo married Anna Katharina Freisinger. They would have a daughter together, Gertrude, whose children would later run the company Boss became infamous for establishing. Hugo and Anna also had a son named Siegfried. Boss's rather routine life in Metzingen was broken by the clouds of war gathering across Europe. For years, tensions had been brewing between Germany and many of the other European powers, notably Britain, which viewed the German Empire that had formed in 1871 as a direct threat to its preeminent position amongst the European powers, and France, which had lost extensive territory to Germany following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, and ideally wished to recover this territory someday. Yet, when war came, it was owing to a regional crisis in the Balkans that primarily involved Germany's ally, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and Britain and France's ally, the Russian Empire. What started as a conflict there soon mushroomed into a pan-European war, and then the First World War. Boss, whose military career had been less than inspiring in the mid-1900s, having failed to earn promotion of any kind at that time, was recalled to the army like millions of other German men. He fought for 4 years of the conflict, eventually being promoted to the rank of corporal. Meanwhile, the shop back in Metzingen suffered, as did all German businesses. In the end, it was the collapsing state of Germany internally, rather than defeat on the battlefield, that brought the conflict to an end in November 1918. Boss headed for home in Swabia with its end.
This video is sponsored by Aura, the app that offers identity protection services, detecting early signs of identity theft, putting your mind at rest and keeping you safe online. Aura is an easy-to-use app that includes everything families need to protect their identities, money, passwords, devices, and more. Plus, there's 24/7 customer support via phone and live chat. And so with 2.5 million identities stolen every year, there's really no better time to protect yourself online with Aura. Aura is a comprehensive, affordable, and easy-to-use security product. It keeps your sensitive information secure by monitoring in multiple areas. Aura will warn you if your password becomes compromised or if someone tries to forward your mail. And it includes an identity theft benefit of up to $1 million. It's really easy to set up and has everything you need, such as parental controls, antivirus, ID theft and transaction monitoring, all at one affordable price. Plus, Aura has a Smart Vault encrypted storage facility and parental controls such as screen time limiting, usage monitoring, and device management to keep your children safe online too. Browse safely, surf smarter. Just click the link in the description, aura.com/people, and sign up now.
He returned to a Germany which was in turmoil. The Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated his throne in the closing stages of the war, and a new republic, named after the town of Weimar, the city where its first members met, had been established. But it had a very tenuous hold on the country, with socialists and other radical groups trying to seize power in cities like Berlin and Munich. Millions of men had suddenly been demobilized from the army, and paramilitary groups were forming everywhere. To compound matters, hyperinflation had hit the new German currency, the Papiermark, and this was detrimentally impacting on businesses such as the Boss family store in Metzingen. In this environment, Boss simply tried to keep his business afloat. In the end, it was several years before stability returned. But not before hyperinflation reached its peak in 1923, and the French and Belgians invaded the Ruhr region of Germany that same year in order to force the German government into meeting its war reparations payments. In tandem, extreme right-wing and left-wing political parties and groups began to emerge across the country. But 1923 was the worst of the crisis, and thereafter renewed global economic growth began to pull Germany out of its post-war malaise. As Germany exited the crisis, Hugo Boss demonstrated signs of growing ambition. Up to that point in his life, he had never demonstrated much aspiration to better his position, no doubt safe in the knowledge that he was to inherit his family's business and would live a comfortable life as a result. But the war and the crisis that followed seems to have changed his outlook. Thus, in 1924, we find him actively seeking out financial support from other manufacturers in Metzingen in order to open a textiles factory. Boss's thinking here was that he could become the actual producer of clothing in Metzingen, where previously his family had purchased their stock and simply sold it on in the store in the town. Now he would become the producer as well as the middleman. As such, in 1924 he established a factory with several dozen sewing stations at which he employed between 20 and 30 seamstresses, working in shifts to produce all manner of garments, from shirts to the traditional German Lorden jackets. Soon the Boss factory was taking on big orders for companies to produce uniforms and other mass-produced items, and in later years Boss would describe the company as, quote, a supplier of party equipment since 1924. Boss was soon employed by one of southern Germany's most controversial political parties. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, were a far-right political organization which had been established in Munich in the chaotic political environment of 1920. They were rabidly anti-Semitic and viewed the Weimar Republic with disgust for the peace terms it had agreed to in 1919. The party had been banned in Bavaria after attempting an armed insurrection in Munich in November 1923, but their leader, Adolf Hitler, was released in December 1924 and the party was gradually allowed to resume its activities. Yet they still attempted to disguise much of their actions in the mid to late 1920s. As such, it was not 100% clear if Hugo Boss knew who he was producing clothes for when he received an order for a large number of brown uniforms from a Munich-based textiles distributor named Rudolf Born in 1927 or 1928. In reality, this order was to produce the brown shirt uniforms worn by the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, whose name translated as Storm Detachment. In any event, had he known who he was working for, there seems little doubt that Boss would have completed the order anyway, given his subsequent actions and political affiliations. Hugo Boss's business flourished in the 1920s as the world economy boomed in a period of pronounced economic growth across Europe and the Americas during the post-war period. During the Roaring Twenties, as the period became known, countries like Germany experienced average annual growth rates of 4%. The US economy alone expanded by over 40% during the 1920s, one of the sharpest periods of growth in modern history. Credit was easy to obtain, and Boss was able to expand his business in Metzingen accordingly. However, Much of this economic expansion was based on speculative investment, which created a huge economic bubble, one which burst spectacularly in the autumn of 1929 with the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression followed, and Germany was one of the worst-hit nations, in large part because it had borrowed enormous sums of money in the 1920s to pay off its war reparations. Boss's business was badly impacted by the economic crash, and by 1931 he was forced into bankruptcy as spending on clothes and virtually everything else other than food and the bare necessities dried up across Germany. However, Boss was handed a lifeline by his creditors, who agreed at this time to let him keep 6 of his sewing machines. Consequently, while he was now bankrupt, he had a minimal amount of means to start over again and build his business back up. It was in an effort to do so that he became deeply involved with the Nazis. While the fortunes of Boss and many other German businessmen were plummeting in the early 1930s, those of the Nazis were flourishing. They had always been a very minor political party in Germany, one which garnered little more than 2% of the vote in Reichstag elections, and most of that being confined to Bavaria in the south. But the economic crisis saw a surge in popularity for the Nazis in the 1930 Reichstag elections, gaining 1 in 5 votes and becoming the second largest party in Germany. In the years that followed, millions of Germans flocked to join the Nazi Party and its paramilitary groups, the SA and the much smaller SS. The latter in particular wore distinct quasi-military uniforms, and the surge in popularity created a major need for new uniforms being produced quickly during the early 1930s. Perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, given his financial straits in 1931, Boss joined the Nazi Party that year as member number 508,889. If this was a strategic move to acquire contract work from the Nazis, it proved effective. Within weeks, Boss had secured a major order to produce brown shirt uniforms for the SA, as well as the black and brown uniforms of the Hitler Youth Organization. This provided a lifeline to the Hugo Boss textile company in Metzingen, one which allowed him to survive the Great Depression and rebuild his business after the bankruptcy of 1931. Boss is most closely associated today with the manufacture of the uniforms of the Schutzstaffel or SS, an organization whose name means Protection Squad, and which was established in 1925 as a kind of bodyguard for Hitler and the upper ranks of the Nazi Party. It had been expanded in the intervening period, and under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler from 1929 it began to rival the SA, eventually superseding it as the preeminent Nazi paramilitary organization. Members of the SS wore a variety of uniforms over the years. Between 1929 and 1932, their uniform was brown and closely resembled that of the more numerous SA members. But in the early 1930s, Himmler decided that a change was needed, one which would set the SS apart from Ernst Röhm's brown shirts in the SA. The new uniform is that which is most closely associated with the SS, being largely comprised of a black uniform with the SS runic symbol, Nazi armband in red, which contrasted with the black uniform, and a black wool greatcoat for inclement weather. Boss soon received orders to mass-produce some of these new SS uniforms for the regime. These added to the business windfall he experienced having joined the Nazi Party in 1931, and by late 1932, his business had not just survived, but was beginning to grow again. It should be noted here that Boss was not responsible for designing the uniforms of the SS. This was primarily the work of 2 other individuals, Walter Heck and Karl Diebitsch. Heck was a German graphic designer who was working for a company called Ferdinand Hofstadter in the city of Bonn in 1929. Hofstadter manufactured badges and logos and were approached that year by representatives of the SS to design a logo for their uniforms. Heck was given the job and designed the SS rune symbol, which looks like a cross between 2 S's and 2 lightning bolts. He was paid 2.5 Reichsmarks for his work, a sum equivalent to $2. But he was not an innocent bystander who unknowingly designed the symbol of the organization that would later run Europe's concentration and death camps. Heck was already a member of the SA in 1929 and later joined the SS himself. His SS symbol was soon adorning uniforms which were designed by Karl Diebitsch, an artist and a member of the Nazis since their very earliest days in 1920. It was he who approached Heck to design the SS symbol, and it was Diebitsch who designed the SS uniform and much of the other paraphernalia which went with it, such as the SS swords and daggers. Thus, while Boss would be responsible for actually manufacturing many of the uniforms which members of the SS would wear, the design of these same uniforms was not his. Boss later claimed that his main reasons for joining the Nazi Party in 1931 were practical, insofar as he wanted to acquire work contracts from them to produce their uniforms, but also because he liked their ideas on how to end unemployment in Germany in the early 1930s and pull the country out of the Great Depression. However, he didn't stop with just membership of the party itself. He became an associate member of the SS in due course, as well as joining the German Labour Front, the Reich Air Protection Association, the National Socialists' People's Welfare Organization, and a range of other Nazi bodies, such as the Reichsbund for Physical Exercise. It is hard to disentangle if he joined these bodies for ideological reasons or simply because that is what millions of other Germans did after 1933, as early that year the Nazis seized power in Germany and turned the country into a one-party dictatorship. Having risen to become the most popular party in the country in the Reichstag elections of 1932, garnering nearly 40% of the vote in one election, the Nazis effectively reached an agreement in January 1933 with the German business community and the center-right political establishment, whereby Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany. This Faustian bargain gave way within weeks to a complete seizure of power. Despite the beneficial contracts that Boss had received from the Nazi Party to manufacture uniforms for the SA, SS and Hitler Youth from 1931 onwards, his business did not balloon in size overnight. Rather, the early to mid-1930s were years of consolidation. Work was steady, but market restrictions that were imposed from the Nazi seizure of power in 1933 onwards limited the capacity for growth. For instance, a ban was imposed on exporting German textiles abroad, a protectionist measure designed to boost the German textiles sector. However, for Boss, whose company was located in an ideal position in southwestern Germany to benefit from the export trade to France, Switzerland and Austria, this was an impediment to his business's growth in the mid-1930s. In addition, the clothes Boss was manufacturing were far from high-end fashion. They were functional clothes, often made with synthetic fibers, which the Nazi regime was keen to promote the use of in order to end Germany's reliance on imports of foreign cotton and wool. Moreover, while Boss benefited from his Nazi contracts, they did not make him a rich man overnight, and the fact that the factory at Metzingen had stalls at trade fairs to sell goods to the wider public is indicative of Boss's varied business dealings in the first years of the Nazis being in power. This all began to change from 1937 onwards as the German army and Nazi paramilitary organizations began growing exponentially in size, and the regime handed out numerous large contracts to produce uniforms to textile factory owners such as Boss. As a former seamstress who worked at Boss's factory throughout the 1930s, Edith Poller noted some years later, "When the large orders began coming in, we were dizzy with relief. We had the feeling, we finally made it." This was reflected in the scale of the income of Boss's business. In 1932, the company had an income of approximately 38,000 Reichsmarks, a sum equivalent to $27,000, not a negligible sum in the 1930s, but nevertheless a limited figure for a company that employed nearly 50 people and which had acquired a number of substantial contracts in the past year. That figure had increased gradually to reach 200,000 Reichsmarks by 1936, but ballooned in the 2 years that followed, topping 500,000 Reichsmarks during 1938. It would eventually exceed 1 million Reichsmarks in sales in 1940. Thus, in the course of the late 1930s, Boss went from being a limited textile manufacturer with a few contracts from the Nazi Party to a major regional contractor working for the state on sizable contracts. Boss's workforce grew in tandem with his business. In 1932, when his business first began to recover from the Great Depression as he acquired contracts from the Nazis, he was only employing about 20 people. Moreover, not all of these were working in his factory. Most were Arbeiters or workers, but a small number were Heimarbeiters or home workers. The number of both types of worker increased gradually in the years that followed, such that by 1936 Boss was employing about 100 people, of which 2/3 worked from his factory and 1/3 from their own homes. With the increase in business from 1937 onwards, these numbers grew considerably. In the course of 1938, the number of Boss employees reached 200, with approximately 130 of these operating in the factories and 70 from their homes. Thereafter, the growth in employees slowed, but by the early 1940s, there were over 250 employees in total. During the peacetime years of the 1930s, and indeed even during the early stages of the Second World War, it was possible for Boss to find staff, but eventually he would run into difficulties in doing so, and it was this situation that has created most of the controversy surrounding the Hugo Boss Company's wartime record. That Boss's business operations had been expanding year on year from 1936 onwards was entirely owing to the accelerated pace at which the Nazis were preparing for war. While Hitler and his closest associates had always planned on a new European war to avenge German defeat in 1918, it had initially been believed that it would take until 1941 or 1942 before the German economy was sufficiently prepared and the army remilitarized to a sufficient extent to allow the country to go to war. However, as the 1930s proceeded, Germany's economy performed better than expected, and its remilitarization plans were not matched by a commensurate military buildup by Britain and France. Consequently, plans for war were accelerated, and an aggressive foreign policy adopted, one which led to the annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Sudetenland in September 1938, and then Czechoslovakia in March 1939. By then, Britain and France were rearming, but Germany was buoyed enough to invade Poland in September 1939. With that, Britain and France declared war on Germany in what would become the Second World War. Poland was conquered by the Nazis within weeks, followed by Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and then France early that summer. By July 1940, the all-conquering Wehrmacht had created a territorial empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Poland and western Ukraine. This rapid militarization and conquest had, of course, led to a dramatic increase in the size of the German armed forces, and with it the number of uniforms needed to clothe soldiers, members of the SS, and other military regiments. By 1938, for instance, there were approximately 700,000 men in the German land forces, but this number increased very rapidly to over 2 million military personnel by the end of 1939, and further again with the new campaigns initiated in 1940. The German army reached an unprecedented size in 1941. As we will see, the Germans launched an invasion of the Soviet Union that summer, which involved 3 million men, most of them coming from within Germany and the territories it had annexed. All of this created increased demand for the uniforms being produced at textile factories such as those run by Boss at Metzingen. As new campaigns were initiated and new soldiers were conscripted, each of these needed uniforms, while the SS was also growing in size as the number of concentration camps that were being operated by the Nazis in Central and Eastern Europe expanded. These were run by the SS, and the paramilitary group would eventually balloon to nearly 1 million members, each of whom needed uniforms such as those Boss produced. In addition to increasing the demand for uniforms produced at textiles factories such as that run by Boss in Metzingen, the changing war situation had a major impact as well on the German economy. With millions of young and middle-aged German men being called up for military duty, there was an increasing lack of manpower available at home. More women were drafted into working in German offices and factories, But even this could not plug the gap. In this environment, the Nazi government turned to forced labor in the early 1940s to keep the domestic economy running. Men and women were identified in occupied countries and effectively detained by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, and shipped off to Germany to work in factories there. The Poles and Czechs were the two ethnic groups which suffered most from this development in the long run. But forced labor was also extracted from other nations. In the case of Boss's factory at Metzingen, approximately 140 forced laborers, most of them being women, were brought to the South German town to produce uniforms there. Of these, the majority were Polish, though for a time there was a group of 40 French women providing labor there too. The latter were the first to arrive in April 1940, but they were gradually replaced by Polish workers in 1941. This was the third largest group of forced laborers in Metzingen during the war. Overall, 1,240 forced laborers were involved here. Metzingen was a relatively average-sized German town, so the presence of over 1,200 forced laborers here gives an idea of the extent of the use of forced labor across Germany as the war went on. We might ask what the conditions were like for these forced laborers in Metzingen. Firstly, many of these individuals had been brought to Germany against their wills, often coerced by the Gestapo and other Nazi authorities in Poland. When they reached Metzingen, the conditions differed for men and women. Male forced laborers at the Boss factory lived in a shed on the factory grounds, one which was rudimentary but sanitary. Conversely, places were found for the female laborers living in the households of local German families. That is until 1943, when a dedicated camp to house the forced laborers in Metzingen was constructed on the back of the passage of a local law that summer which directed that forced laborers should live separately from local German residents. Funding for this camp was limited and hygiene here was poor, while food supplies were inadequate, particularly during the winter months. It should be noted that the Boss company made an effort to provide a better standard of meal to the forced laborers in the factory's canteen. Laborers were paid, but after a certain time it is debatable whether any extra provisions could be acquired by the Poles of Metzingen on the black market using their small salaries. They were also expected to work 12 hours a day, which, as the war went on and labor shortages prevailed, eventually also became expected of Germans. Generally speaking, forced laborers at the Boss factory later recorded a relatively positive impression of Hugo Boss himself, claiming he was generally kind to the workers. But some of the foremen and other managers running his large factory were committed Nazis and treated the workers harshly. It would seem that Boss did not actively intervene to prevent such mistreatment when it occurred, although the extent to which he might have been aware of it is debatable. While Boss's attitude towards forced labor might have been ambiguous, events in the early 1940s were to ensure that forced labor became an ever more prevalent part of the German wartime economy. Having conquered France in the early summer of 1940, the Nazis had briefly attempted to force Britain into surrendering through a naval blockade of the island and a sustained bombing campaign. However, this was soon abandoned as Hitler determined to conquer Nazism's great ideological enemy, the Communists of the Soviet Union. Thus, in the summer of 1941, the greatest land invasion in military history was initiated as 3 million Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Needless to say, the military build-up attendant on Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi code name for the Eastern Campaign, produced an ever greater demand for Boss's uniforms. However, while the campaign was initially successful, in the winter of 1941, the German advance stalled, and the Nazis began to suffer significant casualties for the first time. Then the United States ended the war on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union. By 1942, the Germans were on the back foot in both Russia and North Africa. They would lose the campaigns in both regions in the first half of 1943. By that time, conscription was being widely extended across Germany to increase the number of soldiers being sent to the Eastern Front and to Italy, where the Western Allies opened a new Southern Front in the summer of 1943. And as all of this occurred, the reliance on forced labor to keep factories like Boss's in Metzingen operating to supply the army increased. This new period of war ushered in the concept of total war in Germany, whereby the entire nation was mobilized to aid the war effort. Previously, many Germans had been relatively uninvolved in the war. A 60-year-old German shopkeeper would have heard and read about the Wehrmacht's immense military successes in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. But unless he had a son of fighting age, he would not have been personally involved in the conflict. This changed with the advent of total war in 1943. With this, men in their 40s were suddenly being conscripted and sent to the front lines. The shopkeeper might have been able to continue his work, but if he had a daughter, she might have been directed towards working in some part of the war economy. And everyone would doubtlessly have noticed the arrival of trainloads of Czechs, Poles and other subject peoples to Germany's cities and towns, where they were sent off to factories like Boss's at Metzingen, to effectively provide slave labor. Every part of Germany's economy and resources was now to be utilized to the maximum extent possible to try to change the course of the war. Boss's factory was no different, and the number of forced laborers being made to work there increased to 140. In the end, it is estimated that 15 million people were employed as forced laborers in the Third Reich, the majority being Slavs and other ethnic groups which Nazi ideology identified as racially inferior to the German people. The ambiguities which are involved in assessing Hugo Boss's use of forced labor and his treatment of these workers are demonstrated by the case of one forced laborer from Poland named Józefa Gisterek. She was one of 4 laborers who died whilst working for the Boss company during the war. The other 3 are believed to have died from natural causes, but Gisterek's death was seemingly avoidable. She was sent from Poland to begin working in the factory at Metzingen in October 1941. Her sister Anna had already been sent to the factory in 1940. While she was in Metzingen, Józefa received a letter from her father back in Poland concerning family matters. She subsequently applied for leave to return for a time to Poland, but when this was rejected, she eloped anyway to the east. Back home, she was identified and arrested by the Gestapo. Józefa was not sent back to Metzingen, but was detained in several concentration camps, including the notorious death camp Auschwitz in Poland and Buchenwald in Germany. Eventually, Boss discovered her location and organized for her to be sent back to work for him at Metzingen. He did not punish her, but the foreman of the factory did, and refused to let her see a doctor despite being in poor physical health after her stint in the concentration camp system. Eventually, Józefa had a physical breakdown, following which she was granted a 3-month vacation permit. At the end of this 12-month period, Józefa ended her own life at the home of the family who were hosting her in Metzingen, rather than return to working at the textiles factory. In a sign of the ambiguities which surrounded the use of forced labor in Metzingen, Boss personally paid for Józefa's family members to travel to Germany from Poland to attend her funeral, and covered the costs of the funeral himself. While Gisterek's story is tragic, the whole case highlights the contradictions involved in Boss's use of forced labor during the war. While forced labor was deeply immoral in and of itself, there is also little doubting that there was some humanity in Boss's behavior. He paid for Józefa's funeral expenses and to bring her family to Germany to attend it, while he must have also been quite unusual amongst German business owners at the time in granting one of his forced laborers 3 months of leave to rest and recuperate. He might also be viewed as having effectively rescued her from the concentration camp when he had her brought back to Metzingen. Yet, at the same time, Boss can be said to have singly failed to prevent the abuses committed by the foreman of his factory, and it may have been these which contributed substantially to her decision to take her own life. Overall, the case highlights the contradictions in Boss's wartime conduct. It should be borne in mind when evaluating Hugo Boss and his company's actions during the Second World War that this was far from the only major German company which had strong ties to the Nazi regime. In terms of German automobile manufacturers, Audi, Porsche and Volkswagen were all strongly associated with the regime. Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of the Porsche car company, was himself a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. Audi utilized slave labor from the Leitmeritz concentration camp to produce its cars during the war, a camp where approximately 4,500 people were effectively worked to death, while Volkswagen was first established in 1937 as a branch of the German Labour Front, a Nazi organization. Beyond car manufacturing, Deutsche Bank provided funding for the construction of Auschwitz. IG Farben, a chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate which was the parent company of modern pharmaceutical giant Bayer, produced Zyklon B, the gas which was used to mass murder millions of people in the death camps in Poland and elsewhere. And IG Farben was effectively in charge of the third camp at Auschwitz, known as Auschwitz-Monowitz. Finally, some of Germany's most powerful industrial families, such as the Krupps and Flicks, were involved in the Nazi rise to power and later used tens of thousands of people as slave laborers in their factories during the war. Boss's operation in Metzingen ultimately pales in comparison with some of these other companies in terms of their complicity with the regime and involvement in its crimes. By late 1944, Germans like Boss and the other inhabitants of Metzingen must have been aware, regardless of the relentless Nazi propaganda to the contrary, that Germany was losing the war badly and that defeat by the Allies was imminent. Metzingen was not in the crosshairs of the Soviet armies, which began pouring into eastern Germany and heading for Berlin in the first months of 1945. But they were close to the front lines of the Western Allies' invasion of the Rhineland that same spring. While many of their forces also pushed forward to try to join the Russians in besieging the German capital, divisions of American and French troops fanned out to the south into Bavaria and other regions like Baden-Württemberg. Because of its position in the extreme south of Germany, it was April before Metzingen was occupied by the Allies, just days before Hitler killed himself in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945, followed just over a week later, on the 8th of May, by the surrender of Nazi Germany. Metzingen was subsequently incorporated into the French zone of occupation. Boss was soon identified as a person of interest in the town, owing to his factory's associations with the Nazis and the use of forced labor there. In the months that followed the end of the war, the Allies divided the population up into different groups depending on their level of involvement with the regime. On the one extreme end were the surviving senior Nazi ministers, such as Hermann Göring and Albert Speer, who were to be tried before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Members of the Waffen-SS who had run the concentration camps were also deemed to be war criminals. On the other end were the average German civilians who were deemed to be uninvolved in the regime's crimes and unable to resist the totalitarian state. However, there were numerous groups in the middle, such as German business owners who did not specifically orchestrate the regime's crimes but were complicit in them by, for instance, using forced labor in their factories or aiding the ascent of the Nazis in some way in the early 1930s. These individuals were to be placed on trial and classified variously as followers of the regime or activists and supporters, and depending on their designation, they would be fined or serve brief prison sentences. This was all part of the policy of denazification, through which the Allies also sought to remove former supporters of the regime from positions of social, political, and economic authority in post-war Germany. Because of his position in Metzingen, Boss was quickly identified as someone who would be involved in the denazification process in the French-occupied zone. Boss was initially identified in late 1945 as an activist, supporter, and beneficiary of the National Socialists movement in Germany on account of his work for the regime and use of forced labor in his factories. He was accordingly fined 100,000 Reichsmarks, and in line with the general program of denazification, he was prohibited from running the factory in Metzingen henceforth. This was one of the stricter sentences which the Reutlingen Chamber of Commerce, which dealt with Boss's case, could hand down, and was decided on owing to Boss's early membership of the Nazi Party, having joined in 1931 before their ascent to power. The fact that he had benefited financially from his ties to the Nazis, and also his links to George Rath, a local senior Nazi official who had become notorious for his heavy-handed actions in Metzingen during the war. This was a heavy fine, one which Boss appealed successfully, having his status reduced to that of a follower of the regime, a designation which carried a much lighter penalty. In part, this was because the denazification process was followed less strictly in the French-occupied zone than in the British and American zones to the north, in large part because so many French people had been implicated in collaborating with the Nazis through the Vichy regime during the occupation of France. Boss might have escaped with a lighter sentence in the end for his complicity with the regime, but he did not live for long thereafter. He died on the 9th of August 1948 in the town of Metzingen. In part, he was a casualty of the post-war deprivation which prevailed across the country. Rationing continued for years after 1945, and in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was also a severe shortage of basic medicines. Consequently, Boss was seemingly unable to gain access to antibiotics to treat the abscess which had developed in one of his teeth. A tooth abscess, if left untreated, can lead to infection spreading throughout the body and eventually death, which is exactly what happened to Boss in the course of 1947 and 1948. Even before Boss's death, the company he had founded had been taken over by his son-in-law Eugen Holy, who had married Hugo's daughter Gertrude, as Boss himself had been prohibited from running the business as part of the denazification program. Holy struggled to make ends meet at first, but eventually acquired a number of contracts to manufacture uniforms in the late 1940s. Then, in the early 1950s, the Hugo Boss company branched out into men's suits, and the business expanded considerably. By the time Holy retired in the late 1960s and his two sons, Jochen and Uwe, took over, Hugo Boss was a very substantial suit manufacturer within Germany itself. But it was Jochen and Uwe who turned it into an international brand, in large part by focusing on branded men's suits and beginning a very successful partnership with the McLaren Formula One racing team. By the 1980s, Boss had expanded into fragrances and men's apparel, and had become one of the biggest fashion houses in the world, to the extent that the Marzotto Textile Group were willing to pay $165 million to acquire 3/4 of the company in 1991. Today there are over 1,000 Hugo Boss stores worldwide, and the company's annual sales average €3 billion, but success would also bring increased attention to the company's past. In the 1980s and 1990s, as its brand continued to grow, the Hugo Boss company came under increasing scrutiny regarding its wartime record. Where the complicity of companies like Porsche, Deutsche Bank and Bayer in the Nazi regime's crimes was well established by then, little had been said or written about Hugo Boss and the use of slave labor at his textile factory at Metzingen to produce uniforms for the SS and the Wehrmacht. A number of articles appeared in prominent newspapers and publications in the mid to late 1990s, including the New York Times, following the release of a set of accounts in 1997 held by a Swiss bank. A lawsuit against the company on behalf of Holocaust survivors followed soon after. The company did not shy away from this uncomfortable spotlight, and instead took the decision to finance additional research into the wartime record of Hugo Boss and the company he ran during the war. The result was a book first published in 2011. The text, written by Roman Köster, was entitled, in translation, Hugo Boss 1924-45, a clothing factory during the Weimar Republic and Third Reich. This book used company records and other sources to examine exactly what had occurred at the Metzingen factory during the war and to shed light on Hugo Boss's role in the crimes of the Nazis. As a result, there is now detailed information in the public domain about the company's wartime record, and the company has since apologized for its past actions. Hugo Boss is a difficult character to assess, in large part because he was a private, enigmatic individual who has left little record of his personal views behind. For the first 45 years of his life, he was an unremarkable figure who operated a small clothing store in a mid-sized German town. The most striking aspect of his life up to that time was that he had acquired enough ambition in his late 30s to try to expand his business operations into opening a textile factory as well. It is only from the early 1930s that his actions are notable. Although he had undertaken work for the Nazi Party in the late 1920s, it is unclear if he was even aware who he was producing brown shirts for at that time, and it was not till 1931 that he began actively working for the Nazis. He also joined the party at that time, although he would later assert that he did so for practical purposes to save his ailing business. Following the Nazis' seizure of power, he gained an increasing number of contracts to manufacture their uniforms, most notably the striking black uniform of the SS. His business prospered as a result, and by the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, he was employing well over 200 people and was one of Metzingen's most successful industrialists. There is no doubting that his factory utilized forced labor during the war, with upwards of 140 Polish women effectively used as slave labor here between 1941 and 1945. However, Boss was no sadist or Nazi ideologue, and while he failed to protect his workers in all instances, there is clear evidence of him looking out for their welfare during these years in many different ways. This is ultimately Boss's wartime record. He was punished accordingly after the war for it, and while it is not a good record, he was certainly very far from being the worst figure within the German business community during the Second World War. Other German companies, many of which are massive multinational corporations today, were directly involved in the Holocaust and the use of tens of thousands of forced laborers. As such, while Boss's wartime conduct and involvement with the Nazis was not ethical, it does need to be looked at in perspective. What do you think of Hugo Boss? Should he have received greater punishment after the war, and should the company he founded have been wound down? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.